but it's mostly blue, so the actual blue ring would be white with a blue edging around it. So I did read those. They have about 500 slots, and that was difficult. I still have laundry problems because
I'm not taking the mic.
Good evening, everybody. Super excited to have our speaker here, Dr. Mickey Tobler. He was stolen to us by Amsoul from, let's see if I get the states in order correct, Kansas State University. Who stole him from Oklahoma? Mm-hmm. Who stole him from Texas A&M? Who stole him from Zurich?
No, Norman, Oklahoma.
Oh, I forgot Norman, Oklahoma. How
Yeah.
could I forget Norman, Oklahoma?
Everybody does.
Probably for good reason. Hey, it's not as bad as Stillwater.
He also has a dual appointment with the zoo doing education and conservation, which he's still figuring out what he's going to do with. But that's a pretty exciting position to get. He also gets to go to work with 225 aquariums.
300 something.
300, now it's off. Okay.
Off by 100.
Skipping over Norman. He also marries well, apparently.
I do.
His wife, Courtney, is the editor of Amazon's magazine. And so we are super lucky to have this aquarium power couple here in St. Louis. Anyway, Mickey does work with mostly mollies, he told me, and weird evolutionary environments that he's going to tell you about, but it includes sulfur. So, watch the smell, huh?
No kidding.
It's going to be a hard thing to explain to the classrooms in that next door.
Yeah.
Give a warm welcome to Mickey Tobler.
Awesome. Thank you. Sure. Does this work? Yes, it does. All right. Well, thank you so much for the nice introduction. It's great to finally settle in St. Louis, and thanks to Chaco, I knew all about this club, and I think before my wife even moved here, I actually became a member. So, as Steve said, I work for AMSO, where we mostly do research in kind of evolutionary biology and physiology questions. I also teach fish biology and other classes there. And then I'm very fortunate to also work at the zoo. I have this dual appointment. And at the zoo, we're really working mostly on conservation-related projects. Right now, the zoo doesn't have a whole lot of interesting fish stuff going on. Is this going in and out, or is it working? Let's see. Is this too low? Yes, this is too low. Too many mics. Nope. I have an idea.
For those who don't know, we also have our speakers on YouTube Live, and most of them stay up there unless the speaker wants it down. So you can watch any of the past speakers if you go to the Missouri Aquarium Society YouTube and click on Lives.
I'm very inept, as you can tell, with technology. Let's see. Does this work? All right. So the zoo right now doesn't have a whole lot of fish projects going on. I think the most exciting aquatic thing going on there right now is the Hellbender project, which is super successful. But I'm settling there too, and we're starting some projects in New Mexico on endangered mosquito fish. We have some ideas about projects on cavefish conservation, both here in Missouri and in Mexico, and then there's also some projects emerging in Brazil that involve kind of conservation-oriented fisheries of ornamental fishes. So I was just coming back from there, kind of figuring out what could be done there. But so, as Steve said, like my bread and butter research or work really focuses on piscillates, the life-bearing fishes. And I was just going to talk today a little bit about what piscillates are, about some of the diversity and maybe some of the species that not everyone has heard about, even though you have Mike Helweg and Chuck here in the club that probably have introduced all the species that I'm going to show you here today. But so, who has kept a piscillate before? Okay, who's never kept a piscillate before? Okay, we've got to work on you. You're the only one. But right, when people think about life bearers, they usually think about 3, 4, or 5 different things. The The most prominent one, probably the guppy, right? Everyone has had guppies before, except for you. We need to give him some guppies. So it's the guppies, the mollies, the platies and the swordtails, which are in the same genus, Cyphophorus. And then a lot of the scientists are usually also interested in the mosquito fish. That's the gray one at the bottom. Many hobbyists don't really care about them because they're gray, but the scientists care about them a great deal because they're invasive around the planet and are destroying basically native communities. And so it's the big five that usually when people say livebearer that people think about. But it turns out Pasilids are much more diverse. In fact, there is around 300 species in this family, and many of them are really attractive aquarium fish. So what are Pasilids? Well, the big thing that distinguishes Pasilids from many other fishes, not all, but many, is number one, as their common name says, they're life-bearing. So females don't lay eggs, but rather they retain the embryos within their body and they give birth to live young. And to make that all possible, right, the eggs need to be fertilized somehow. And so males have this adaptation that is called the gonopodium. That's kind of that stick-like organ at the belly of the fish there. It's nothing but a modified anal fin that has a bunch of structural changes that allows the males essentially to move this thing around. And it's this gonopodium that the males use to essentially inseminate the females that facilitates that live birth, that internal gestation and the live birth. That's what all the Pasilids share. And as I said, it's a pretty diverse group. They're widely distributed from kind of North Carolina here in the United States all the way down to Argentina. So they have a fairly wide distribution, and I think the only, or the major glaring gap, as you can see on the map, is kind of the Amazon basin, where they're not very diverse. Now, if you Google what a Pasilid is, you're probably going to find information about not all Pasilids being livebearers. You will say there's only basically a part of that family that gives birth to live young, and another part of the family are actually egg layers. And it will tell you that a bunch of killifish from Africa are actually the most close relatives to the Pasilids. And that goes back to some scientific research in the 1980s, where an ichthyologist essentially analyzed the morphology, kind of the bone structure of all of these different fish, and found very close similarities between the African killifish and these Pasilid fishes that are distributed throughout the neotropics, and concluded, well, they're so similar in some of their bone structures, they must be closely related. But what we've learned with kind of the advent of DNA sequencing is that those bone structures in the African killies and in these livebearers are not similar because they're closely related, but because they have essentially evolved independently from one another. So what you see here on the left side is kind of the evolutionary tree of Pasilids. That long white line basically delineates all the taxa within the livebearers. And then the question, of course, is, well, if these African killifish are not the closest relative of the Pasilids there, what is? And it turns out there are other livebearers. They're also distributed in the neotropics. So Pasilids are most closely related to the four-eyed fishes, anableps, and the one-sided livebearers, the Geninsia, that occur in South America. So the Pasilids are truly the livebearers. So a lot of the information on the internet is still not up to speed. But there's basically been continuously new insights about what the kind of the interrelationship of these species are. And we've learned a lot about the evolution of livebearing as a consequence. Now, as I said, there's around 300 species. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to introduce you to some major groups of Pasilids. And I'm essentially just going to walk along this phylogenetic tree a little bit. And the most kind of basal lineages of Pasilids are things like Xenodexia, Tomerus, and Phylloceras. that occur in the Guatemalan highlands and in South America. As you can see, there's only really crappy pictures of these things. The reason is these things are really not in the hobby, or at least not anymore. The Phylloceras, caught immaculatus, used to be incredibly popular fish in the hobby in the olden days. So when I was a kid, they were still kind of around, and at least in North America, I think they have disappeared from the hobby. I still know a few people that keep them in Europe. But these taxa are really rarely kept in the hobby. And Don, see that crappy picture there? That's why we need to get Livebearers into the United States to do a better job. So these are ancient lineages. They're ecologically very different from many other piscillates, and especially Livebearers, that's that skinny long fish, the weird thing down there. This is actually the only piscillate that lays eggs. So these fish have reverted back to egg laying. And females, I think, carry, based on some reports, carry only 1 or 2 eggs at a time that they then lay in the water. But there's very little known about the actual life history of these species. So if we walk along this tree a little bit, the next kind of large group is one of the largest groups of piscillates that include Nesterodon. Those are those spotted fish on the top right. Chuck Bremer kept Nesterodon for a long time, and I'm happy to say they're still doing good in my fish tanks. Also a species that formerly was fairly common in the trade and has largely disappeared. And Nesterodon comes from southern South America, whereas all the other fish in this clade are mostly distributed in Central America, across the Caribbean island, and even reach into North America. So all the other essentially tips of this tree are things that were formerly lumped in a genus Piscilia. So these include the mollies, the guppies, but also the limia from the Caribbean islands that are fairly popular in the hobby, and the micropiscilia from South America that are related to the guppies. They're often called swamp guppies that are also relatively popular in the hobby, but they're not easy to keep, so they're often not very available in the hobby. So it's a very diverse group, lots of very attractive species. I'll show some more throughout the talk that are suitable for aquarium the size of like 5 gallons with some of the micropiscilia to fairly large species like the sailfin mollies that really need 55-gallon tanks and up to really thrive in captivity. If we walk a little further, there's a clade that are called the Cuban radiation, and I call it the Cuban radiation because the entire group of species is restricted to the island of Cuba. And this group includes Quintana, which is a genus with a single species, Quintana atrizona, which used to be common in the hobby, and again, can't be found anymore. And then a number of species, I think it's 7 in the genus Gyrodinus. This is a group that at least one species is in the hobby. What is it called in English? Gyrodinus metallicus. I think it's the black belly livebearer. It also comes in a yellow belly form. The yellow belly form is actually more common in the hobby now than the black belly form. And neither the black belly nor the yellow belly form are actually very common in nature. They make up less than 1% of the males that are caught. Most males in nature are actually plain belly, which, surprise, surprise, are actually not in the hobby at all. Very easy to keep fish, and the black bellies are particularly interesting because they have this really cute kind of dance routine that they do together during courtship. So my daughter calls these the dancing fish. If we move a little further along the tree, there's something that I call the Mesoamerican radiation, because it includes a number of genera that are primarily distributed south of Mexico, but north of Colombia. And these species include in general like Alfaro, that's the knife livebearer on the top left. as well as Priapictes, which is right below. These are really cool species that have a center of distribution around Costa Rica. They're ecologically really interesting because they're specialized ant and terrestrial insect eaters. So especially Priapictes, that's the fish with the orange fin. If you look at the gut content of these fish in nature, it is 90+% ants. So they primarily live in these rainforest streams where it rains almost daily, and through that rain that hits the leaves above them, ants fall in the water, and that's really what they're specialized on eating. Other popular aquarium fish from that group include Phalictes at the very bottom. These are species with very long gonopodia. This particular one is Phalictes fairweatheri. It's probably the rarest one in the hobby, but common ones are things like Phalictes quadripunctatus, a tiny life bearer, and also the merry widow, Phalictes amatis, that are around fairly frequently. And then the last one up there is Brachyraphis, also known as brachies. These are kind of weird life bearers because they behave more like cichlids. They're really aggressive. Females frequently beat the crap out of the little males, and these are really species that need a little bit more space. And you gotta watch these fish with hawk eyes, because when they drop, if you don't find the fry first, the parents will, and they will eat everything. And then last but not least is Heterandria, the least killifish that you also see frequently offered on aquabit, for example, a tiny species of life bearer that, even though it's related to the Central American life bearers, is actually more closely, actually occurs here in the United States along the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. And then there's a fairly species-rich group that are called the Pacific radiation. Most of the life bearers occur along the kind of the eastward flowing rivers in North, Central, and South America. But there's one group that has really diversified in westwards flowing rivers that go into the Pacific. And that's the genus Poeciliopsis specifically, and then there's a less diverse group called Neoheterandria. These things are rarely in the hobby. I don't understand really why. My only explanation is they don't really have much color, but that usually doesn't deter many of us. So there's at least 40-some species in these genera combined, and other than maybe the teddy life bearer, none of these are regularly found in the hobby. And then last but not least, there's a large radiation that mostly occurs in North America, which includes Mexico. So this includes some relatively unknown groups like Scolictes and Carlhapsia. Carlhapsia is that second fish from the top, a really dainty life bearer. I find them very attractive, although they're not very easy to keep. And then it also includes some more well-known groups, like the Siphophorus, which includes the swordtails and the platyfishes, like the Gambusia, the mosquito fish, as I told you about initially. And then fish that are relatively rare in nature, but more common in the hobby, are things like the Priapella, which is at the bottom left, that blue-eyed life bearer, which inhabit kind of fast-flowing waters in mountain streams in Mexico. So all of this is to say, there's lots of life bearers out there for you to play with. And I think the notion that life bearers are these ideal beginner species is true in the sense that there's definitely some life bearers that are really easy to keep, very easy to reproduce. But there's also a long list of species that have not really been successfully kept over multiple generations in captivity. We talked about Limia garnerii today at dinner, which is a species from Haiti that everybody really struggles to keep alive and reproducing in aquaria. Now, let me talk a little bit about the reproductive biology of these fish. Because on the one hand, it sounds trivial, right? You have males with a gonopodium that they use to inseminate females, and then the females essentially keep their eggs inside and eventually give birth to live young. But it turns out there's some interesting variation among different groups in how that really plays out. And within the males, kind of the big dichotomy is in the structure of that gonopodium. So on the left-hand side, you see essentially skeletal representations of one type of male, and what you hopefully notice is their gonopodium is really, really long. These are species that are going to have gonopodia that are usually longer than a third of the length of the body. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have species that have relatively short gonopodia. And it turns out that the way these males behave and reproduce is very different. So long gonopodia species are disproportionately species that engage what we call coercive mating. So these things are basically chasing down females day and night, and they try to mate with the females whether the females cooperate or not. On the other hand, species that with short gonopodia tend to be species that have male traits that they try to show up during courtship. So short gonopodium species tend to be the species that have exaggerated coloration, or enlarged dorsal fin, or this enlarged tail fin that we see in swordtails. So there's essentially this dichotomy between these coercive mating strategies and these cooperative mating strategies. And behavioral ecologists have done a lot of studies essentially to try to figure out why certain traits evolve under certain conditions and other traits evolve under other conditions. So here's just a few examples of long gonopodium species and a few examples of short gonopodium species. You can see particularly the exaggerated traits in terms of color and fin exaggerations in these short gonopodium species. That is not to say that short gonopodium species don't coerce. They do, but they usually do it in a context-dependent manner. That is also not to say that none of the long gonopodium species court. This is just kind of a general gradient in kind of the morphology and the behavior of these fish. There's also variation in the female reproduction. Yes, they're all life bearers, but the way the offspring develop inside the female and the way they are provided with nutrients is very different among different species. Many species in pasilids, like the mosquito fish, they simply retain eggs within their bodies. So what essentially happens is that females produce a batch of eggs, they put a bunch of yolk in there, right, that the offspring use during development, and once that yolk is formed, males fertilize that egg, and the offspring starts developing. And during development, they simply use the yolk that the female put in the egg. There's no additional nutrient transfer. And so as a consequence, as these fish grow inside the mom, from like an egg this big, they kind of get smaller and smaller and smaller. They lose weight during development because some have just burned off due to these metabolic processes. And then eventually they're born. So they kind of shrink during development until they're born, and then they start growing when they eat, right? We call that a lessithotrophic life history. And then there's a number of species that do something very different. In those species, females only put a tiny bit of yolk into the egg, males fertilize the egg, and then the embryos start growing. And in those species, females actually have a placenta that has exactly the same function as placentas in mammals. Females essentially provide their young with nutrients throughout development. And as a consequence, these embryos grow, they gain in mass during development, sometimes 100 or 500-fold. So essentially the nutrient provided after fertilization is very, very important. What these species often also do is that they have a phenomenon called superfetation. That means that females don't just produce a batch of eggs, they grow them out and give birth, but they produce a few eggs a day, they start growing them, and they start producing a few more and start growing them. And as a consequence, you get different stages of offspring within the females. So what you see on the right-hand side is a Peciliopsis, that's one of those Pacific pasilids. And you can see there's essentially 3 stages. On the very top, on the right-hand side, you see basically part of the ovary. And there's 3 little eggs, right? Those are 3 freshly produced eggs that are about to be fertilized. Then there's a number of individuals that are kind of intermediate size, and you see little embryos along with that structure they're embedded in. This is part of the placenta. And then you have a third stage of development where embryos are much further along. So as a consequence, and that's relevant for breeding these fish, less heterotrophic species, they give birth to just batches of fry every 3 to 4 weeks, right, depending on the species. Matrotrophic species that have superfetation, they can drop fry at very irregular intervals. Sometimes you get like 4 or 5 fry one day, and then a few days later you get some more fry, because they're really staggering these fry through time, essentially. So what's even more interesting is that the reproductive strategies of the males are actually correlated with the life history of the females. So males that engage more in coercive mating strategies, they tend to have females that are matrotrophic, whereas males that have more courtship behaviors and have more cooperative approaches to mating, those females tend to have more less heterotrophic life history strategies.
Are they storing sperm?
Yes, that's a great question. The question was, do they store sperm? And yes, to our knowledge, all pacillids store sperm. And the sperm does get old though. So in the literature you can find reports of sperm storage lasting up to a year. I think my experience and the experience of many breeders is, as you basically have with isolation from males, kind of the efficiency of production of young really goes down. And that's due to an effect that's called spare sperm precedence. So essentially, the most recent male that inseminated the female has the highest likelihood of being the father of the offspring. And that's the reason why these fish are so sexually active, right? All of y'all that have kept pacillids, the males are just constantly at it, because you want to be the last one, right? If you were the last one, you have the highest chances of actually siring all of those offspring. But yes, sperm storage is very common, if not universal, in this group. Great question. So, pacillids are very diverse. There's a lot more to it than just those top 5. And this is not only true between species, where you have lots of different kinds of species. A lot of pacillids actually also very variable within species. These are different males of the variable platyfish, Aphophis variatus. They were all caught in the same pool. They were all part of one population. And the reason why these fish are so popular in the hobby, right, is because there's essentially a lot of variation in coloration in this case that breeders can work with, right? You can take some of the variation and line breed it and make a golden platy or a blue platy, or you can combine some of these tail elements and make Mickey Mouse platies, right? On the bottom, you have a tail spot male. That's controlled by a single gene. That's the head of the Mickey Mouse. And the second male from the bottom has this spot on top. This is called an uppercut crescent. If you breed the males, these two males, if you cross them properly, you're going to get a Mickey Mouse with one ear. If you get the lower cut crescent male in there too, you can make a full Mickey Mouse. So all of these elements that you see in some of these captive bred domesticated strains, right? Those are elements of color variation that are present in nature. And what breeders have done very efficiently is recombining some of this variation, bringing it together and then line breeding particular strain so males don't vary anymore. And I think this is true for many, many pacillid species that are, seem like very uniform in captivity, like Endler's guppy, for example, right? They're all for a particular strain, they are largely invariable in their color. But if you go into nature, you will find all of these color combinations right there in one place. So they're much more variable in nature, and it's the line breeding, the inbreeding in our aquaria that makes these things so uniform. And so this is always interesting to me when I talk to breeders and then they say, well, your fish doesn't look right. It's like, no, my fish looks totally right. We just got these from Mexico. This is how they look in nature. but people get kind of used to a particular phenotype, right, that is common in a fish tank. They probably all go back to a handful of fish that were collected many generations ago. And so these kind of uniformity that we often observe and assume in our tanks is really an artifact of our breeding practices and not really reflective of what's going on in nature. Now, I'm really lucky that, as I mentioned, I get to study these fish for a living, and part of that is that we get to go out into the natural habitats of different species, sometimes here in the US, more often in Mexico and other portions of Latin America, and we get to see these species in their natural habitat. And so I just want to show you kind of some sort of a random assortment of fish that I think are cool and that you all should keep, especially you haven't had any pasilids yet. So take this as the inspiration for you. And I want to start here in North America. As Steve mentioned, I used to live in Kansas, and about 10 minutes from my house used to be a creek called Shane Creek. It was kind of in this culvert. It's really nothing spectacular. And if you would go there this time of the year, you find absolutely no live bearers. And you go back in March, there's still no live bearers. And you go back in May, and there's maybe a handful of live bearers. And then you go back in August, and 90% of the fish you catch are the western mosquito fish, Gambusia affinis. Not a very attractive species, I guess, because nobody appears to keep them in fish tanks anymore. But you should totally try them out at some point. They're easy to breed, as long as you're faster in the mouth of the parent, because they're voracious predators of their own young. If you go further east into the Everglades, they have a different species of mosquito fish, the eastern mosquito fish, Gambusia holbrooki. It's very similar superficially to Gambusia affinis, very similar in terms of how you keep it. What's fun about Gambusia holbrooki is that it's polymorphic. Some populations have polymorphic males, where you find both spotted forms and plain forms. And this is a species that you actually can purchase every now and then on Aquabit, especially early summer when hobbyists in Florida get bored or need some money to spend in the fish store. They'll go in the backyard, catch a bunch of Gambusia, and then ship them all over the United States, which is great because people keep them, but it's also terrible because this is one of the most invasive species on the planet. So if you ever keep them, you don't want them anymore, don't flush them down the toilet. Feed them through your cichlid or something like that, because if they get out into the environment, there's a good chance that they can establish. Another species in Florida, if you kind of go down into the Keys, is Gambusia rhizophora, which is a really interesting species because if you buy the Freshwater Fishes of Florida book, it will tell you all about Gambusia holbrooki, the eastern mosquito fish, but it will tell you nothing about Gambusia rhizophora. The reason is because Gambusia rhizophora is not a freshwater fish. It's actually one of the very few species of the livebearer family that is restricted to high salinity environment. Now, lots of livebearers, if not all, can tolerate high concentrations of salt in their environment, but very few permanently inhabit marine environment. But Gambusia rhizophora is one of them. Fairly easy to keep, even in fresh water, even though they don't actually occur in fresh waters. So that's basically the view from the east. If you go further west, it just gets more interesting. Because it turns out Gambusia, the mosquito fish, are one of these groups that have colonized arid land springs in Texas and New Mexico. So these are desert springs that are fed by these groundwater updwellings. They're very isolated in the landscape. And in many of those springs, you have different species of mosquito fish. What you see here is Spring Lake in San Marcos, Texas. If you've ever been to an ALA meeting, probably in Texas, you probably visited that site. I know, Pat, you might have been there in the past. It's a beautiful place that harbors a number of endangered species. So what you see in the water here is Texas wild rice. It's a federally endangered species. I think that's only left in the San Marcos Spring. And what you find along with it is large spring Gambusia, Gambusia geyseri. There's also a fish that's related to the eastern and western mosquito fish, but exclusively occurs in these spring areas. They simply can't compete with other species in the creeks. And so while San Marcos Spring has Gambusia geyseri, other portions of West Texas and New Mexico have different species, like the Pecos gambusia, for example, Gambusia nobilis. What's really interesting is this thing is essentially listed as threatened because it only occurs in 2 Texas springs. At the same time, it's actually invasive and threatening other gambusia in other springs in Texas. So even though you might be endangered in your original home, you still can do a whole lot of damage in other places. And so the last fish I want to show you from the United States is this one. It's one of my personal favorites. I did my entire master's thesis on this species. This is Picilia formosa, the Amazon molly. And it's not called the Amazon molly because it comes from the Amazon. It's the Amazon molly because it's named after the Greek warrior tribe, the all-female Greek warrior tribe. And the reason for that is because this is an all-female species. There is no male Amazons. You'd be like, well, how do they reproduce? Well, it turns out they can clone themselves. But they can't clone themselves without help. It turns out they still need sperm from a male to start the development process of the embryo. So where do they get the sperm from if there's no male Amazons? Well, it turns out they always coexist with other molly species. In Texas, it's the sailfin molly, Picilia latipina. In Mexico, it's the Atlantic molly, Picilia mexicana. And these females essentially go wander around, enticing males of other species to mate with them, which is not very hard because they're piscilids and they're constantly humping something. But they don't do anything with the genetic information of the sperm. They just leave that out, and every offspring is a perfect genetic copy of the mother. So fun little fish, also very easy to keep. You just need to find males from another species.
How much genetic diversity is actually in the species? Are they fairly clonal overall?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how much genetic diversity is in this species? Because they all clone themselves, right? And the old hypothesis was like there must have almost no genetic diversity. And it turns out they have lots of genetic diversity. And there's a little bit of a debate where it's all coming from. But there's some indication that they have some mutations in DNA polymerase. That's the molecule that replicates DNA, and they have higher error rates during replications than the sexual species. And so they have surprisingly high genetic diversity for a species that has been clonal and has been around for over 100,000 years. The other thing is they have huge population sizes. So there essentially is enough of them for there to be kind of a maintenance of genetic variation in the populations. So
now, if I've had fish like that I've caught, does that mean it is a separate species, or do the females of other species look like that as well?
So that's also a very interesting question, because the origin of this species was actually a hybridization between sailfin mollies and Atlantic mollies. So they look distinct from all the other mollies. And if you look at their dorsal fin is perfectly intermediate from the sailfin size that you find in the sailfins and the short fin that is typical for Mexicana. So there are distinct species. They're easy to identify from all the other mollies. In fact, that's probably the only molly that I am confident identifying 2 species, because mollies are a mess. All right, so if you go a little further south into Mexico, this is actually where we do most of our work. So most of our work is in the borderlands of southern Mexico. So there's this large floodplain here in the south. I wander here. Right here is the state of Tabasco. And here is basically the Guatemalan highlands. And a lot of our work happens right in this kind of border area between the flatlands and where it goes up into the mountains. And there's a wide variety of habitat types in this region. In the lowland, it's all swamp, essentially. And so this looks like a nice little pond in southern Tabasco. On the left hand is Ryan, one of my grad students. On the left hand is Rachel, one of my undergraduate students. And it's not like Rachel is sitting in there. She's standing on the ground. So these are really fairly deep pools that are kind of littered over the landscape. And during the dry season, all the water and the fish kind of concentrate in these tiny little pools. During the rain season, all of this is all water, essentially. And in this floodplain, you find cute little life bearer like these Phalictis fairweatheri. These are very dainty fish. They transport very poorly, which is, I think, one of the reasons they're not typically found in the hobby. But they're quite common in these kind of isolated pools during the dry season. And males get really kind of pretty coloration when they're reproductively active. If you go a little further inland, some of these water bodies get much larger. So you get these lagunas, like this laguna near the city of Teapa in Tabasco. And in these lagunas, you find fish like these Carlhapsia kirrai. These are fish that live largely in the open water. They're plankton feeder. And again, it's a species that you rarely find in the hobby. And again, it's mostly, I think, because they transport really poorly. As soon as you have them in a bucket, if they just get a little bit too warm, or if you handle them a little bit too much, they just die. And so it's really hard to keep them alive and well, unless you have them in a kind of well-established aquarium. Other species in this area are the exact opposite of Gambusia affinis. This is Belanozox pelicianus, the only true fish eater among the pasilids. Females can get maybe 10 inches, almost a foot long, and these are voracious predators of other fishes. Super fun to keep, not super easy to breed. I mean, they're easy to breed, and they're easy to keep when they're tiny, and you can feed them things like brine shrimp and daphnia, and then they kind of outgrow those foods, and suddenly you need to have a lot of baby guppies to keep these things happy. So the hard part of raising these up is actually having food available for all of kind of these life stages, because they do really poorly with artificial feeds. Now, if you go further south, you enter kind of the mountains in Guatemala, and the water bodies change. Suddenly, you only have streams. There's no more standing bodies of water. And you can see, even in the tiniest creek, you can snorkel. In fact, it's marvelous. You should try it out. You live in Missouri, just north of the Ozarks, and you can literally do this in the backyard, and it's the best fun you can have. It's the biggest aquarium, and the fish just look fantastic. In Mexico, there's almost no aquatic plants. The bottom is usually sand, more often kind of bigger gravel and boulder. In the dry seasons, these are kind of peacefully flowing rivers. There can be a lot of exposed bank. But in the wet season, these rivers flash flood. So this is very different from the rivers in South America, where you kind of have a slow rising of the water and the flooded forest situation, and then during the dry season, the water falls again. Here you essentially have thunderstorms coming in from the Gulf of Mexico, torrential rains, and these rivers can go up feet, meters within a few hours. And then, just as the water rises, it falls again. So they're a very flashy system. I'm showing this picture because this bridge is not there anymore. That bridge got washed out in 2019 during a flood. And so that gives you kind of an estimation just how much fluctuation in water levels there can be. Now, if you're in these sorts of streams, in smaller streams, you find life bearers like these pseudocyphophorus. These are kind of the pit bulls of the life bearers. Females can get 4 or 5 inches long. And like the brachyraphis from Costa Rica, these can be fairly aggressive species. These are hard to breed because they literally eat everything that fits into their mouth. Females can kill the males if you don't pay attention and give them enough space. But then you also have dainty species in streams. On the one hand, in kind of fast-flowing areas of streams, you have Priapella, of which there are several species in the trade. They're beautiful fish. They're easy to keep as long as you keep the water clean and well oxygenated. So these are species that only do well if you are on top of your water changes. If you don't do your water changes, they will stop reproducing. And if you neglect them too long, my experience is you don't usually get them back in condition very well. On the right-hand side, you see Heterophyllus, which is related to mosquito fish. And in nature, these fish are kind of found in pools in between the riffles, and they seem like they're glued to the water surface. So they actually have two glowing spots at the back of the head. I don't know what they're for, but they're super easy to spot. Often from a bridge, you can look down, and the first thing you see is kind of these Heterophyllus scooting around at the water surface. If you have lots of live food available, these fish are super easy to keep and breed. They do too hot on just things like flakes and other things. We've also done a bunch of work in Lower Central America and Costa Rica, for example. The way the habitat looks are strikingly similar to other regions of Central America, like Mexico. So small streams, river that are kind of low, run low and smooth during the dry season and can flash flood during the wet season. Here you get species like Priapictes. These are the specialized anteaters I told you about earlier. You find things like Brachyraphis, the brachys, of which there are several species in captivity. These species tend to be occurring kind of in smaller order streams where there's relatively few predators, few things like parachromies, like predatory cichlids and things like that. Further down, when the rivers are a little bit bigger, you find other species like Xenophallus umbratalis, which used to be a fairly common species in the hobby. We have several colonies here at Amsel. It's a very interesting species because it's the only life bearer that has left hands and right hands. Well, they don't have hands, obviously, but they have a some males have a left-handed gonopodium, and they can only mate from the right side, and some males have a right-handed gonopodium, and they can only mate from the left side. Why? Beats me. Don't know. But it has happened. Another species that's common in kind of these lower land rivers is a knife life bearer. I think they're actually in the club, if I remember. You have them. Alpharocoltratus, there's a second species from Honduras that I forgot to put in the talk. It's more colorful than the knife life bearer. But again, species that like a little bit of flow, that do really well in larger tanks. These are really active species that swim around a lot.
I brought some of those back from Honduras 20 years or more.
Yeah, they're awesome fish. Also insectivore species, super fun to feed these things fruit flies. They go nuts at the water surface, feeding on fruit flies. Just if you want a little bit of action in your tank. And then there's lots of species on the Caribbean islands where we have done a fair amount of work. There's really variable habitats here, anything from kind of these desert spring pools that are occupied by live bearers to streams that are coming off the mountains that have really fast flows to lowland rivers that kind of just meander along. And there's even a hypersaline lake, Lake Enriquillo, in that area that also harbors piscillads, along with pretty massive crocodiles that are fun to see. Hispaniola, so the island that includes Haiti and the Dominican Republic, is home to a whole radiation of limia. These are super popular aquarium fish, and I just got some here. This is tiger limia. Limia is lai. But there's just a large number of species. I think Steve brought some Limia zonata. Yeah, not a great picture. They get much prettier than that. But there's also, there's just a whole number of limias. They're decently sized species that do kind of best in tank size of 20 gallons and up. And are super easy to keep, like great starter species. On Hispaniola, you have two other genera as well that only occur there. These used to be lumped in with the mollies of the genus Picilia, but it turns out they're actually not at all related to mollies. They just look like them. One genus is Cycropicilia, and it has 2 species. One of them is seen here, and the other genus that has been described is Curripinus elegans. And this is one, Curripinus elegans is another one of these tough nuts to crack. Not a fish, it's hard to transport, and when people bring it back successfully, they have a really hard time of keeping it alive and keeping it reproducing. These are species that live in high elevation, cool streams with clear water, and they make very few babies if they actually do reproduce. Now, I'm saving basically my favorite for last, because Steve kind of mentioned something about stinky places and sulfur. But one of the groups that you pretty much find everywhere, from southern Texas down to northern South America, are the mollies. And mollies have occupied my fish tanks and my brain way too much over the past 20 years. But they're fascinating. The longer I look at them, the less I feel I know which species is what, because they're utterly confusing, because they're so variable. And things that you think surely are different species, if you sequence their DNA, they turn out to be exactly the same. And things that you think are all the same, and you sequence the DNA, and it turns out they're all different. To me, they're endlessly fascinating, and they're also endlessly frustrating. But the coolest thing about mollies is they can live in places where few other species of fish can live. In fact, they live in places where few other animals can live. The weirdest place inhabited by a fish, arguably, is located in southern Mexico, in a place called the Cueva de los Zuvre. This is a pretty small cave. It's about 300 meters long. It's pretty easy to access. And as you can see, it's well illuminated here with artificial lights, but it's completely dark in there. It's a cave. But it also has this really weird water coloration. And the source of that water coloration is sulfur, ultimately, because the water that comes out of the ground into this cave is rich in hydrogen sulfide. That's the substance that smells like rotten eggs. And it turns out that rotten egg substance, hydrogen sulfide, is highly toxic to fish, to any animal for that matter. Because what hydrogen sulfide does, it basically attacks the function of the mitochondria. The mitochondria are these cellular structures inside of our cells, and they're responsible for producing energy that our cells can use to do whatever they need to do to be cells, right? So when you're exposed to hydrogen sulfide, it attacks your mitochondria, no more energy is produced. It's like flipping the breaker in a warehouse. All the lights go out, everything goes dark, you die. That simple. There's so much hydrogen sulfide in the water here. If you take a fish from a stream and you top it in there, it's dead within about 20 to 40 seconds. This is highly toxic. This is not just a little bit inconvenient. This kills you instantaneously if you're a fish. If you're a researcher, we have gas masks, buys us a little bit of time. But this is highly toxic, right? But you walk in there is fish everywhere. It turns out there's one species of fish, one species of molly, and we call them the cave molly, that has colonized these toxic habitats, and through evolutionary time, not only adapted to permanent darkness, they've also adapted to tolerate these really toxic substances in their environment. Why do they go in there? It turns out there's one thing that's good about the sulfide, and that is it provides nutrition for microbes. So just like plants can use the energy from sunlight to essentially grow, there's microbes that can use the chemical energy from the sulfide to grow. So everything inside the cave is covered by microbial mats that essentially the fish are eating as their food. So when you first look at these, you can probably see they have like smaller eyes, right? They're kind of pinkish, but this really pops out when you put a cave molly next to a surface molly. So here you can really see kind of the trait differences, kind of the loss of coloration and the reduction of eye in this species. And just to blow your mind a little bit, we collected these fish Well, if I'm in the cave right here and caught the cave molly, over there, where the lights are on, where the cave exits, the stream exits the cave, that's where we call it the surface fish. So these fish are occurring just less than a minute of walking apart. They're connected with the stream, yet they look completely different. If you sequence their DNA, they're actually genetically differentiated. Those two fish. So they're very closely related, but they're separated somehow, right? And some of our analysis have shown that they probably have separated somewhere in the last 8 to 10,000 years. So this is a case where we really can see evolution unfolding right now, right? So these are very closely related species. They inhabit completely different environments, and selection, the different conditions, they're favoring individuals that possess different traits. So if you are pale and you have tiny eyes and you get washed out of the cave, you're probably going to get eaten by a bird. And it turns out, if you're a surface fish and you get into the cave, you actually get eaten by giant water bugs. So it turns out the cave fish have not only reduced their eye size and lost their pigment, they also have gained things. So on some of the things they have gained, they have more taste buds. It turns out they have taste buds all over their body. That's why fish don't shake hands, because it would be gross. You would taste just whatever your friend has touched recently. And they also have a more elaborated lateral line system, so they can feel their way around in the darkness. And that feeling around in the darkness not only helps them find mates and food in the darkness, it also makes them better at avoiding these water bugs than the surface fish. So you have these fish that are essentially adapted to the different conditions, and that's what actually is maintaining their differences on such a small spatial scales, because otherwise you would expect them to all homogenize. And with that, I hope I live in St. Louis for a long time and I get to talk to you about mollies more, but it's 9 o'clock, and I think I went a little longer than I anticipated. But if you ever want to get in touch with me, my email is just tobler@amsel.edu. And I think there will be a time in the near future where we're probably going to invite you all to AMSEL so you can see how we keep our fish and what we do in more detail there. Thank you.
Lights fast over there, Mike.
Happy to answer any questions if anyone has one.
Do the water bugs survive the sulfur?
Yes, because they breathe the atmospheric air. So the way that some things survive in the cave is that the sulfite gets into the bodies through the gills, right? And so everything that needs to breathe or gets oxygen from the water automatically also exposes their bodies to the sulfite. But the water bugs, they literally breathe through their butts. They have a siphon, right? And when they're hunting, they're sticking their siphon up through the surface and having the arms in the water. And so they're evading a large amount of the sulfite. They live in there, and you can see they're actually covered by sulfite bacteria. So all that fuzzy stuff is that biofilm, the sulfur bacteria that cover everything. But they are not exposing a lot of their respiratory surface to the water, and as a consequence, they don't get exposed to sulfite nearly as much as other species. Weird, right? Yes?
Has, anyone tried keeping them in fresh water and not, salty water?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, can you keep them in normal water? And the answer is absolutely yes. We keep them at AMSEL, and they are happy in normal water. They don't need the extreme conditions. They just can't tolerate them, while most other things can tolerate them. And as a consequence, they're living in a great place, right? There's no competition. But yeah, they do perfectly fine without the sulfite. It's not like they're super happy there. So these fish are living under really stressful conditions. And even with all the adaptations that they have, they still struggle. If you stress out these extremophile fish too much in a bucket, for example, if you don't pay attention, you will get huge mortality. But yeah, they don't need it. They can do it if they need to.
What do you feed them in freshwater if they're used to eating microbials that feed off of?
Great question. What do we feed them? So these guys, the cave mollies, they're not very picky. So we're successful keeping them with on whatever else we feed our fish, which is mostly kind of a homemade version of gel food and lots of baby brine, and then whenever we're lazy, a little bit of flake. There's also some mollies that don't live in caves, but they live in surface springs that are high in this sulfide. They're also adapted to eating these microbes. And we can keep them in the lab successfully. We can bring them back, and they do fine for a few weeks, and then suddenly they're all gone. And I think one of the reasons they're not doing well is because we can't really provide them with the right food. And so nobody really has cracked that nut. But I'm personally convinced it's the diet that's the key to keeping those. But we haven't found a good replacement diet for those species. But yeah, some like the cave mollies, they'll eat anything. Yes?
You commented on how invasive the mosquito fish can be.
Yeah.
And I remember reading somewhere that if it wasn't for so many mosquito fish, we'd really have a problem with mosquito-borne diseases. So how does that balance out?
Yeah, and that's really interesting. That's why they're invasive everywhere, right? Because they're like, oh, we have these tiny fish, and we can just put them in our rivers and swamps, and they will eat all the mosquito, and we get rid of malaria, right? And so you often have one branch of the government, like the health ministry, right? They're spreading mosquito fish everywhere, and then on the other hand, you have like the natural resources manager, they're like, oh my God, like the invasive species are killing off all the things. And so I would say that the evidence. Well, so we've destroyed a lot of ecosystems with invasive species. And it's hard for me to justify, knowing how much damage we can do, it's hard for me to justify introducing species for mosquito control when we have other means of mosquito control now. There's also really mixed evidence on how good some of these species are in combating mosquitoes. Because yes, they will eat mosquitoes, but like especially like Gambusia around the Mediterranean, they will eat mosquitoes, but they will eat all the fish eggs first because they prefer to eat fish eggs, right? So, and in the case of guppies, for example, guppies are not great mosquitoes. I think, yeah, don't put out, this it's not good practice. And I think the field has largely arrived at that. And what we're dealing with the invasive species are these legacies, right? Of things that were done 50, 60, 70 years ago, and now you just can't get rid of these species. Yes? So, get you. Say it again?
What is a good fish for mosquitoes?
Whatever's native. I mean, in your backyard. I mean, here I would use something native, right? I don't know. Hummingbirds? No, I think, look, Western mosquito fish are native in Missouri, so that might be a safe bet. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to give good advice on that. So taking a rain check. Oh, okay, so the last picture, this was taken in a sulfide spring that's at the surface. So, as I said, the Cueva de los Uvas has these springs inside the cave, right? Some other locations have these springs outside, just in the open water. This is in southern Mexico. This is a place called La Gloria Springs. And where the photographer is standing, I wish I could say I was the photographer, but I'm actually smoking a cigarette underneath the far right tree there when I was still young and had bad habits. But where the photographer is standing, the water is bubbling out of the ground. And the reason why these rocks look so messed up is that when the sulfide comes out and has contact with the air, it reacts with the oxygen to form sulfuric acid. And the sulfuric acid is literally eating away at these rocks. That's why there's a cave. The springs that are now inside of the cave, they used to be surface springs, but over the years, they just have eaten themselves into the limestone, and they basically the acid is eroding away the rock. Turns out the sulfuric acid, fish don't care about it. The water is really well buffered. It erodes the rock. For the fish, it's this hydrogen sulfide without the oxygen. It's really damaging. But yeah, they're crazy environments, and the smells are weird. And if you look into the water, it looks white, right? That's because there's bacterial mats, inches thick, that cover everything. Because it's such a rich resource for those microbes that just gobble up all of that energy and cover everything. And so the microbes that you'll find in these springs are actually really similar to the microbes that you find in deep sea hydrothermal vents, which also have lots of hydrogen sulfide. Don't ask me how, but I guess it's been like 3 billion years, right, that these microbes have been on the planet. Somehow they made it down to these deep sea vents 10 miles below the water surface, and they also ended up in these weird springs in southern Mexico.
Is the mechanism known, the resistance against the H2S?
Yes, yeah, that's actually our research, yeah. So the way they do it is twofold. So they have an enzyme in the mitochondria that's part of what's called the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. That's where sulfide binds. And so they have changed the configuration of that enzyme so the sulfide cannot bind anymore. So the enzyme keeps working and it's not toxic anymore. What they also can do is they can detoxify the sulfide through an enzymatic reaction. All of us actually can. This is something we inherited from our microbial ancestor. It's also in the mitochondria. We can all detoxify sulfide. But we can only toxify it at minute concentrations because our body produces sulfide at minute concentrations. When we break down some amino acid, some sulfide is produced as a byproduct, and we're able to mitigate that. So we're talking in technical terms, we're talking about nanomolar concentrations. So that's like one sulfur molecule, I don't know, in a billion other molecules or something like that. Very low concentrations. So when we get exposed to environmental sulfide, system just gets overwhelmed and we die. We're able to upregulate that. So they're able to detoxify that sulfide at a much, much, much faster rate. So it's that kind of twofold strategy that they're using to actually persist in these environments.
When you get the outside springs like that, do you have intermediate type of species that does not have the cave adaptations but does have the other?
Yeah, great question. The question was, when we have the springs outside like that, do we have intermediate kind of populations or species? And the answer is no. So the way these springs usually work, they bubble out of the ground, they run for a little bit, and then they join a river, or they go over a waterfall. And so it's not really a gradual change in the sulfide. It tends to be rather abrupt. So it goes from really, really high, comes slightly down, and then blonk, it dumps. And I don't have a picture right in this presentation, but we have like contact areas where, you can walk through the creek, the sulfide spring into the regular creek, and you catch a molly here, and you catch a molly over there. And they're genetically completely separated. And we have populations where they have been separated from another for an estimated 20,000 years. Somehow, they don't interbreed.
The ones underground also had adaptations for low light living. Do the ones outside also have those because they're shared with that population?
No. So it's not only the sulfide adaptations that segregate, the light-dark traits, they also segregate along that gradient. Yeah. Great questions. All right. Thank you all for coming. It was fun talking to you all. And hope to see you soon.